All right, let's get to work. My name is Johannes Urpelainen. I'm the Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Professor and Director of the Energy Resources and Environment Program here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'm also the founding director of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, or ISEP. And I'm very glad to see all of you here. We are pre-celebrating the launch of our new book called Escaping the Energy Poverty Trap. It will formally come out in November, so we're a little bit ahead of the game, but I don't think that's a big deal. I'm pretty sure that my academic publisher, MIT Press, would not have bothered to actually bring in books or anything in any case. So we might just as well enjoy the good weather and get to work. So what I'll do today is, first of all, just note that the book is available for pre-order. This is very important. Every time I sell a book, I think I make $1 or something. Maybe a little less because there's 4 of us sharing the immense profits. So that's sort of what it is, but it's an MIT Press book. It's available on the publisher's website. And if you want the default option, you can just go on Amazon and type in Escaping the Energy Poverty Trap. The hardcover is a lovely $90. The paperback is a little more reasonable. It's there available for pre-order. You will get it in early December if you order it by Amazon. Okay. That's all I'm gonna say as far as advertisement comes. And what I'm going to do today is first I'm gonna show you a little video just to give you a sense of what energy access is all about. And in particular, taking the perspective of what is life like without energy access. So there's 2 questions we can ask is what are the benefits of energy access? That's actually a fairly complicated question. A much simpler question is what is life like without energy access? So let's start with that. This is just going to take about 5 minutes, and I think it will tell you the story. That should give you a fairly basic understanding of what's happening in these households when they do not have energy access. This was a project we did in India 4 years ago. I was still at Columbia, so hence Columbia Department of Political Science, and we worked with the Council on Energy, Environment and Water on this topic. I wanted to show that because I wanted to give you a somewhat more real introduction to how this works in these households and why we care about this particular topic. And it's all downhill from here. Now we are going to get to the academics and start talking about a little bit on what the data shows and in particular why this is happening. So really the goal of this book project was to understand what are governments doing to solve this problem, why are they sometimes trying to solve the problem, why are they sometimes failing despite trying to solve the problem, and most importantly, what is the set of conditions under which they want to solve the problem and they actually succeed in making some progress. So we take a pretty high-level look at this at the level of national governments and how their policies and decisions influence lives on the ground. Here is a picture. This is from 2016, which gives you a rough sense of what electricity access looks like. This is using the simplest possible metric you can imagine, which is just, do you have a connection? In the video, they made a big deal of the fact that just having a connection is not enough, but we gotta start somewhere. So let's just look at this particular metric first. And so what we've done here is we've kind of like removed the OECD countries and the post-communist countries from this picture because all of those countries were electrified a long time ago. They started at a much higher level of wealth and so on, and the challenge of electrification is really in the past 30 years has been all about the developing countries, the non-OECD and the non-Soviet successor countries. And if you look at this picture in 2016 or so, you see that we've made tremendous progress in Latin America and Central America, China, North Africa, the Middle East. The picture is a little more mixed in South Asia, and it's particularly weak in Sub-Saharan Africa. So there is tremendous regional variation in this achievement. At the same time, even looking at how quickly did the countries get to this level, how difficult was it for them to reach this point, you will see a lot of variation in this. And so, for example, one of the interesting things in Latin America is that Chile is one of the wealthiest countries in the area. It's actually an OECD member today, so technically we should have removed Chile from this picture as well. Turns out Chile was only able to electrify its countryside in the 1990s. It had made a lot of progress in the cities way back 70s, 80s, even 60s, but the countryside was only electrified in the 1990s. So this is pretty interesting. At the same time, some of the much poorer countries in the area, Ecuador and so on, have reached approximately the same level of electrification. So it's not just a simple story of if you're wealthy, you're electrified, if you're poor, you are not. You also see lots of really interesting variation if you look at so India, Bangladesh are at the same level. Pakistan historically actually been ahead, but it's recently lost some of its momentum, and India and Bangladesh have been catching up. Myanmar is a very interesting country. There's a military dictatorship with very little connection with the rest of the world until 2013, and it's only since started to make these investments in electrification. So there's a lot of variation in how far these countries have come, and we want to understand, beyond some obvious things like geography and income, what are the drivers of this variation. The second picture, now I want you to kind of like keep in your head roughly what this looks like, and then look at clean cooking. You see it's generally light, right? So light is bad in this picture. Light means you have not achieved your goal. So when we say clean cooking, that basically means, according to these metrics from the International Energy Agency, does the household have access to some kind of a modern, non-solid cooking fuel? So LPG would qualify, so liquefied petroleum gas, electricity would qualify, but if you're only cooking with firewood, which is what about half of the world still does today, or if you're only cooking with charcoal or something like that, then you would not have access to modern cooking fuels. Okay? This doesn't necessarily mean that households are only cooking with modern cooking fuels. So a very common pattern in many of these countries is that even if you have LPG or electricity, you still continue to use the firewood as your primary cooking source. And the reason for that is that if you want to cook a big meal for your family, it's quite expensive using things like LPG or electricity, so you would use the firewood instead. But if you are in a hurry, you've got some guests coming in and you need to make some tea, then the LPG or the induction stove is a much faster way to do this. Okay? And you in fact saw that in the video, there was this one family that was saying, in the morning we use LPG because we have to get something quickly, some tea and whatever it is that they eat for breakfast, but then during the day we switch back to firewood using the traditional stove or chulha. And that's a very common pattern. But nonetheless, again, the very first step is that you've got to have access to the modern cooking fuel. If you don't have that modern cooking fuel at home, then you will be only using firewood. Okay? So we will mostly talk about in this book about energy access, as in do you have access to these things? What do you do with them? How much you use them? That is mostly beyond what we look at. We are really looking at the first step, which is access. Okay? Okay. So how can we tackle a topic like this? What we wanted to do in this project is we wanted to go, in some sense, one level up from policy evaluation. A very typical standard approach to doing this would be that we look at policies and we try to do some kind of analysis of which policies have been successful and which policies have not been successful. And instead of that, what we decided to do is we wanted to look at higher level, how did the government as a whole succeed or fail? Not just looking at specific policies, but their entire program. Did they try to do something? And if they did try to do something, did they achieve some success? And we, in some sense, took a political economy analysis. We consider politics and economics, and we try to see, when we put this together, can we get some leverage on understanding why some governments have been more successful than others. Yeah. And here's what that looks like in the book. It's a very simple kind of flow chart that will show you how this looks like. The very first question we have to ask, is the government at all interested in solving this problem? Okay? There are a lot of governments that aren't. So if you think about, for example, the Myanmar government before the democratization, they did not really care a whole lot about electrification or cooking fuels in the countryside. It was not really something that they thought was important as a policy issue. So the very first questions we have to ask, is there some interest? If there's no interest, then the rest is kind of academic, because If you don't care, you don't try to do anything. Okay? And here we see, if we just look at the map first of all, but then also think this through theoretically, it turns out that governments tend to be generally much more interested in looking at electricity access than in looking at cooking fuels. Okay? And there's a few reasons for this that we found when we reviewed the literature and looked at some of these cases. One of them is that electricity has a more direct impact on economic production. So in many of these countries, the government interest in energy access actually doesn't come from helping people lead more convenient or easier lives. It comes more from interest in things like groundwater pumping for irrigation or promoting industrialization in small towns. So a lot of the early electrification in particular was driven by this idea that if we extend the electric grid to these areas, we can use it to produce economic value, and then we as a government maybe we can take some of it through taxation or just by taking it if we are a dictatorship, and besides that we might win some elections when we do this. Okay? So this economic motivation is very powerful. The other one is more a cultural one. So with cooking fuels, it turns out that if you look at these different households, the picture of understanding what people's preferences are, how they do things, is actually fairly complicated. There is a lot of strong evidence showing that people generally find these modern cooking fuels, and LPG in particular, very convenient and very useful. So everybody agrees on that. But if you ask people in terms of their policy priorities, where would be getting rid of firewood be? It's rarely in the top 3 or top 5 or anything like that. It's somewhere down there. It's not the first priority that a typical household would have in these countries. Electricity, on the other hand, in many countries is actually pretty high on the list. So you see these governments making these fairly flashy PR campaigns around their electrification schemes. And one extreme example of this is Brazil. So when Brazil started to democratize in the 1980s and they created their constitution in 1988, the constitution actually says that every Brazilian needs to have electricity. Okay? So it was such a big political priority that they decided to put it into the constitution. Okay? They still haven't reached the goal. There are still tribes in the Amazon that don't have it, but nonetheless it's been there as part of the constitution for a very long time. In India, the Modi government currently makes a big deal of the Saubhagya scheme, which is intended to electrify all the households very soon. Cooking fuels, politically, generally less of a motivation. There are some interesting cases where, for some reason, they're actually very high on the political agenda, but typically electricity is quite high up there, and cooking fuels are not. That's the typical politics in this case. The next question then is, if the government has the interest, how can we predict their ability to do something about this? And the very first obvious factor that we have to look at is institutional capacity. This is not rocket science, right? If you want to build an electric grid, if you want to create some kind of a governance mechanism for the power sector, if you want to extend access to clean cooking fuels, you have to implement things on the ground, right? You have to go to these remote villages and help people gain access. So you have to have some capacity to actually implement the policies that you formulate on paper. Institutional capacity is an extremely complicated concept, and I'm not going to go here into the sort of debates in political science and other fields on what it means exactly. We use a very simple operational definition, which just says if the government has a goal and they want to achieve the goal, how likely is it that they are able to do it? And in this case, in the case of energy access, for example, if you look at electrification, you could ask things like, do they have some kind of an electrification corporation that is managed, that has a budget, that has staff? Do they have the ability to do it themselves? Do they have the regulatory capacity to maybe direct some private companies to do this for them? How financially and technically competent are the electricity distribution companies that often do this work in practice in the villages? So there's a number of indicators that we can use to try to understand this. There's not one quantitative measure that says that institutional capacity is 98 out of 100, but by looking at these different things, you can often detect which countries have a fairly high level and which countries have a low level of institutional capacity, and how that changes over time as well. The more original part is this idea of local accountability. So one thing that came through very strongly when we did these different case studies was this idea that often when countries have these strongly top-down approaches to electrification, where the national government just sends these like vast hordes of bureaucrats and officials out there to electrify, it doesn't work very well. Because they lack the local information, the commitment, the buy-in from the community. And when you do that, you often find yourself in a situation where you might be using the wrong technology. You have no idea what's actually the level of demand in this village. You're unable to fund the project because all the money has to come from the government. There is no way to get any kind of commitment, whether it's in kind or actual money from the community. But if you instead have some local accountability mechanisms that allow the communities to participate in this process, share the information and benefit from this, then you are likely to succeed. And this results by just simple logic into this 2x2, where if we have a government that is interested, if it has very little institutional capacity and no local accountability, it's almost certain that it will fail. It will not be able to do much. If one of the two conditions is high, then you will get some partial success. So for example, high capacity, low accountability, very common situation. In this case, there will be some kind of a top-down push. It might be fairly impressive in the sense that poles and wires appear, or LPG connections appear, but there will be all kinds of problems at the last mile in these villages. If institutional capacity is lower but local accountability is high, you might be able to achieve something because there will be some local efforts, and by offering modest support to those, you will get something, but this idea of a coordinated national program is unlikely to succeed. And if both of them are there, then we would expect rapid progress in electrification. Okay. Pretty simple. It's not rocket science. And what we do with this is we take these political economy factors and then we see if these can explain variation when we consider the fundamentals. So when you do energy access planning, there's a few very basic fundamentals that you always look at. One is domestic energy resources. So if you have amazing opportunities to build dams everywhere, then presumably you will have a lot of electricity access because you will get cheap electricity and it's just a question of connecting the homes. If you have huge oil and gas deposits, you're probably making money hand over fist selling it to the markets, and as a result, you just buy this. That's what Iran did in the 70s. They went from nothing to everybody electrified in like 10 years. It's not a mystery. I think their GDP per capita increased by 1,500% in something like 4 or 5 years. When you're swimming in money, there's a lot of private contractors who are very happy to come and build nice things for you, right? So that's what happened there. The third one that is very commonly used is population density. So if you think of a densely populated city, the cost of electrifying an additional household is very low. If you think of a vast area where people are living far from the communities, then it's really expensive. The extra cost of every additional household electrified is very high. So these are some of the fundamentals that I think predict a lot of variation in energy access. Those plus income probably predict something like 80%. And then we hope that much of that remaining 20% could be attached to these factors. Okay? Now, there's one more consideration that I want to bring in before I kind of present the results for you in a very, very concise manner, which is technology. So traditionally, if you look at both electrification and clean cooking fuels, it's really just a question of electric grid extension and LPG. Those are the two primary alternatives. Today we have all these new things, right? So we got cook stoves, we have induction cookers, and more importantly, on the electricity side, we have these distributed resources like home systems and so on. Some of our case studies go way back, and in those cases, it's all about the grid and LPG. Some of them are more recent, so we will look at, for example, Bangladesh and Kenya and how they're using these new technologies to make progress in energy access. So one of the exciting things in the energy access world today is that we have these new technologies that are making the problem a little easier to solve. They don't make it easy to solve, but at least it's a little easier than what it used to be. Yeah. Okay. Here is a picture from India. India is our biggest case, just because that's where we've done the four of us. That's me, Michael Acklin from the University of Pittsburgh, S.P. Harish from College of William and Mary, and Patrick Beyer from University of Glasgow. That's the team for this project. We've done a lot of work in India together. And this picture shows where household electrification is in India. 1987, 2010, using the National Sample Survey data, which we use extensively in this work. And what you see is that first of all, you see great progress. 87 was a lot worse than it is today. But you also see this very interesting pattern where the southern and the western states systematically overperform the northern and the northeastern states. And in particular, you see these two states that in 2010 were struggling, Bihar and Jharkhand. These used to be some of the very poorest states in India. If I updated this map today, Bihar would look a lot better, and the states that are struggling would be actually Uttar Pradesh and Jharkhand. Okay? So in just a few years, there's been this remarkable turnaround in Bihar, which I'm happy to discuss if that's of interest. Those of you who are in my energy access class remember that we often get kind of like digress and start talking about Indian politics for no reason. That's because we have a number of very vocal Indian students, which is great. And then there's me, I'm very passionate about India, so we end up talking about random things. I hope I won't waste your time too much with random digressions today. Okay. So, the Indian story can be told, I think, in three different phases. The first phase, 1947, 1965, there was not a whole lot happening in India. Government interest was not there because the first government of independent India, Nehru's government, had a strategy that was very heavily pro-industrialization and pro-urban development. They said, the goal here is to amass all the capital we have, put it into industry, and create all kinds of nice things like steel and dams and cement using that. Agricultural things, it's kind of an afterthought for us. Institutional capacity at that time was quite low. Not in the sense that India has, in some sense, has benefited quite a bit from the fact that they inherited this reasonably good civil service system from the British. But 1947 is a very poor country, and in particular, very limited reach in the countryside, right? So you had pretty competent bureaucrats in Delhi, in Bombay, in Chennai, and so on, but the reach in the villages, India's 600,000 villages, was quite limited back then. And electrification is all about those villages, right? So that was a major constraint for them. Local accountability is also very limited. It was a very top-down government. There was only one party in power, and there was not an effective local governance mechanism. So Gandhi had made a big deal of this village India idea, that the village is the natural unit of governance, but the reality was that back in those days, the villages did not have a mechanism for doing much here. And as a result of all these things, it's kind of overdetermined. Electrification was very low. India made very little progress in the first 20 years beyond electrifying cities and towns. Okay? 65, 2003, things start to change. So government interest peaks, and that is initially mostly because of the groundwater issue. So India at that time was at a point where people were predicting this kind of mass starvation. The population was growing very fast, but food production wasn't increasing. India wasn't trading much with other countries, and it didn't have the money to buy import food in any case. So there was real concern that at some point this would not work. The thing that solved this problem was the so-called Green Revolution, where you have these new crops, rice, wheat, and so on, that produce much higher yields per hectare. Okay, these came from work done at the International Rice Institute in the Philippines, the Rockefeller Foundation, Mexico. All these places came up with these new agricultural technologies right in the nick of time, and they were introduced in India. The problem was that these new plants take a lot more water. Okay. So you have to find a way to get access to that water. India's monsoon is what it is. You can't control it. Surface water is fairly scarce and mostly used at that point. So there's only one thing you can do, is you can drill and you can find the water underneath. And that drove the electrification drive in the 60s and the 70s. Okay. So interest increased. capacity also started to increase. So even though India had not yet reached a very high level of extensive ability to work in the villages, they did have an electrification corporation now. The different states had created their own systems. They had 20 years of experience of trying to do something. They got some external funding from USAID and other parties. So they had now a system for doing this. Okay? Local accountability remained low at that time. Our reading was that a lot of this was really mostly top-down, where the government looked at, this is where we think we need groundwater, we are just going to do it. There wasn't really any effort into kind of participatory development or anything like that. Okay. Over time, electrification started to increase, and there was a bit of a breaking point in the early 2000s. So government interest remained high, and in fact, it started to shift toward household electrification. So now electricity became a political topic, not just as a measure of economic activity, but as something that should be done in its own right. So the government, the Congress government of Manmohan Singh had this framework where they said, we are going to help everybody get access to certain basic necessities, electricity, healthcare, water, food, things like that. And they made a big deal of that in their elections. They won the election in 2004 against all expectations, while the BJP was quoting the small middle class that was there. These guys were talking about basic necessities for everybody. They won the election, and they started this big rural electrification drive. At this point, they had their system down. So local accountability remained low, even though India now had a local governance system. It didn't really work in most of these states when it comes to electrification. Electrification was still very much a top-down effort, but at least that effort was now done by a fairly large bureaucracy that had enough resources and a commitment from the government. So electrification started to proceed first during the Manmohan Singh government under the Rajiv Gandhi rural electrification drive. So if you are a Congress party politician in India, you gotta call it Rajiv Gandhi. He's the sort of standard symbol for whatever program. As soon as the Modi government from the competing BJP party or Janata party comes in, they of course cannot call it Rajiv Gandhi because he's the enemy, and they call it there's some obscure, what's the name of the, I can't even, yes, yeah, that's right, who was some BJP guy from the 50s or something, nobody's ever heard of this guy, but that's what they do. And they keep doing exactly the same thing as the Congress government had done. They just relabel it for political reasons, and now they have this big Saubhagya scheme. Saubhagya is Hindi for good fortune, and this is a huge electoral point. The elections are coming in May. The first milestone is in March. You do the math, right? This is all very carefully thought through. Okay. So India's story in that sense could be say that India has historically kind of underperformed. They could have done better than this, but in the past few years they picked up pace. And that's why in that video, for example, we see the shift in focus where you move from villages to households, and then from households to the quality of the electricity supply. So that's the big challenge. When we do work in India now, connections are, kind of a topic that in a few years is not going to be a topic at all, because something like 98% of households will be electrified in just a few years. At that point, we will be looking at use of electricity, productive uses, quality of supply, and topics like that. Okay. We also do in the book case studies of different states. So we look at Gujarat, West Bengal, Odisha, and Maharashtra. And we find fairly similar patterns there. We compare both across the states and then within each state over time. It will be all in the book, and you can read it there. Now, the last thing we do on the data side is we look at other countries. So one of my sort of things that I think makes this project kind of fun is that we have these 11 other case studies beyond India. These are obviously not very deep because 11 case studies, come on, who's going to read like 2,000 pages of case studies? But we do see some very interesting patterns here. And the first pattern to note here is that even though success in electrification in this case varies, it is generally better than in the case of cooking. The only interesting exception to this is Senegal. Senegal is one of my favorite cases. We found this kind of at the last minute. So their situation was this. In the 1970s, deforestation was actually a really big problem. You know, Senegal is close to the Sahara Desert, and it was a really big problem, and they were very worried about it. And they did some studies, and they found out that use of firewood in Senegal is actually a big driver of deforestation. They got some funding from USAID and other development agencies, and they actually managed to help people gain access to these modern clean cooking fuels while failing to do electrification. It's a very unusual case. This almost never happens. In almost all the other cases, either electricity succeeds and cooking doesn't, or electricity and cooking kind of succeed. So that's one important pattern. Another thing that we note here that I want to emphasize before I finish my little lecture is that in many of these cases, you see this really interesting pattern where when the country moves from autocracy to democracy, that's when things start to move, okay? So examples include South Africa. So 94 is when Mandela becomes the president. Before that, the white government has very little interest in what's happening among the African majority. In fact, they might be sort of actively discouraging development to avoid any kinds of, you know, empowerment, awareness, and all that. Once Mandela comes into power, South Africa doubles its electrification rate in like 10 years. It's pretty impressive. It's all downhill from there for various reasons that we can discuss, but those 10 years were pretty great. Ghana is a super interesting story. So in the early 1990s, you still have a military dictatorship, but the military dictatorship kind of sees what's coming, and they start to do this. They start to come up with a comprehensive electrification plan. And the guy, I think what's his name, Jerry Rawlings, right, is the dictator back then. He goes to the elections and he says, look, I'm a dictator, times have changed, it's time for democracy, vote for me. I gave you electricity. And he wins the election. So this is a very nice case of a successful transition from autocracy to democracy in Ghana. Brazil, similar story. Brazil has always had a high electrification rate because almost all Brazilians live in cities. So it's not such a difficult thing to electrify like Rio de Janeiro or something. Anybody can do that. But the question is what to do with the Amazon and all that. And that movement really starts in the 1990s, and in particular in the 2000s, when the Lula government creates this Light for All movement, which has been a fairly successful effort. Chile, I already told you, in the 1990s, when General Pinochet is overthrown, and you have this democratic government, they start thinking, what do we do with the countryside? And they electrify. The interesting thing is that they've inherited this fully privatized system. Chile, together with the UK, were the first ones to privatize their electricity system, and they're like, okay, so we can't force these people to do anything. They're private companies, they do whatever they want. So they create this very elaborate system of subsidies and incentives and everything, and it actually works. So Chile makes a lot of progress in electrifying this, fairly difficult conditions. This is like the Andes, right? You've got these communities 3,000 meters above the sea level, and it takes 5 hours to go there on a llama or something like that, right? And still they manage to do it. So it's impressive. One more case I'll mention very briefly is Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is really interesting for two reasons. One is that when they originally started electrification, they created this really bizarre dual structure where they had the electrification board and then they had this like electricity development agency. The electrification board took the approach that we advocate, which is bottom up. They went and created these cooperatives and all that. The electricity development agency just said, that's not important, we're just going to build stuff. And the electrification board made a lot of progress. They were able to increase the electrification rate in a country that was a lot poorer than India back then, pretty quickly. Whereas the other one made no progress at all. And once these new technologies like solar home systems came into markets, Bangladesh was the first country to create a market where they sold something like 3 million home systems when nobody else was making any progress. So Bangladesh, in that sense, they failed in the traditional top-down approach, but in the bottom-up approach, they've actually been fairly impressive. They now have this interesting shift where they're moving into a more aggressive top-down mode again. And I gave an executive education class to the Bangladeshi Electrification Board in New York 2 years ago, and they were asking me, what can we do now? The government is telling us that everybody has to be electrified. We are running out of money. The budgets are just terrible. How do we solve this problem? So this was an interesting case where there was a really big push to get those remaining 10% electrified, and it came at a very high cost. because now there was no effort to actually collect the money from the communities or anything. It was just we have to electrify everybody right now. So it's a mixed bag even today. Progress in terms of rates is very good, but at the same time, it does come at a fairly high cost. Okay, so let's summarize what we've learned here. So we've looked at pretty high level, some very basic fundamental political economic factors. I certainly would not claim that they explain everything. Income, geography, and so on are more important, I think. But once we reach that point, I think the next level is to look at politics. And I think it does have some important policy implications for this as well. So when you look at some of these policy analyses that people have done of electrification, they don't often consider what was actually the level of commitment that the government had to doing this project. There's all this talk about country ownership and buy-in and everything, but if you look at the case studies of the policies, they don't actually look into this. And I think if we want to really understand which policies work, we've got to start with that question. Because it doesn't matter how great the roadmap is, if the government doesn't want to do it, in our experience, in our research, not much is going to happen. And the second thing then is also, I think, for the effort to electrify the remaining people, we're still stuck at another 1 billion people without electricity. I think the right model is to really look for governments who are committed and who want to do this. Because the bang for the buck for doing that is far greater than trying to force countries to electrify because there are some externally imposed target. That just doesn't seem to work very well. The big challenge is going to be clean cooking. So we need some new ideas here. The governments still haven't really sort of waken up to this. I think in the energy access movement, if you follow on social media or in the newspapers or anything like that, there's increasingly emphasis on clean cooking. People, policymakers understand the health benefits of shifting away from firewood, but the governments still don't put the same amount of emphasis on this. So I think there's some fundamental, basic political work that needs to be done here, which might begin with popular awareness or just enlightened bureaucrats thinking through the long-term cost of these health problems that firewood burning inside causes. But I think that fundamental work needs to be done. Before that, it's hard to imagine that these policies would themselves do the trick. Now there's at least one case where we see this happening a little bit now, and that's again India. So Modi government's electrification scheme has a kind of a cooking fuel counterpart. So they're promoting very aggressively the use of LPG through this Ujjwala scheme. And that's kind of interesting because they are now gambling that people are interested enough in LPG that it's worth making it an electoral issue and pushing really hard the message that we are going to get this fuel to everybody. So it might be that there are some lessons in that experience that would help dealing with that. I'm going to finish there. I know I'm kind of standing between you guys and the wine, so I know why you are really here. But I'd be happy to take any questions or hear any comments or thoughts on what I've just said. Maybe we can take a few in a more formal sense and then continue the discussion after that. Yes?
Some of the stuff you saw in Bangladesh, is it really a case of dueling policies, and then there seems to be this third shadow entity where the state government itself is just kind of doing this other thing? Did you find that to be true, or how detrimental is that?
So I don't think it was dueling in the sense that the policies would have kind of explicitly contradicted each other. It was more that they were trying to do two things, one thing through two agencies at the same time. And one of them had a much more enlightened and effective approach than the other. So what happened then is that those districts that were assigned to agency number one started seeing progress, and those that were not were stalling. And at some point the government realized this after they did some studies on it, and then they said, okay, we are going to in fact drop the ineffective approach, and we are just going to move everything. So they learned from that experience. And then the decentralized solar home system approach was built on the model of electrification boards. It had a lot of NGOs played a big role in this. The World Bank provided some lending, but the microfinance organizations participated. Bangladesh is the home country of Muhammad Yunus, right? who's won this Peace Prize for microfinance and everything. And he was actually a very active player. One of his academic publications describes what they did and what. Yeah.
From what I understand about your the book you're talking, or that you guys wrote, there seems to be a really big normative assumption on the benefits of clean cooking fuel versus traditional methods. And knowing that developing countries have limited resources, could you walk me through like how you made this, how you evaluated the value of clean cooking fuel versus all other options you can spend money on?
So that's a good question. For the analysis of why there hasn't been a lot of movement on clean cooking, we don't need to make any normative assumptions. But when we turn into these policy implications where I tell you that we need to do all this work, that's where we have to bring in this idea of benefits. I think the case is first and foremost one of health. So if you look at the damage that this firewood cooking does to people when you do it on a daily basis, it's often, something like 4 to 8 years of decrease in life expectancy. I think if air pollution kills 8 million people a year, half of that at least comes from indoor air pollution. So if you just look at the human cost, you could basically, in that sense, you could say that this is a problem at the scale of malaria, and by now actually more than malaria, because we are making a lot more progress on malaria than on this. But at the same time, there is a kind of a tension here, right? Is that I think it's important. The economists can make all kinds of computations, turning these lives into numbers and dollars and everything. And then when you go and look at what people are doing, they don't consider it necessarily a very high priority. So that's one thing that I think we still haven't figured out is how do these households actually think this problem? I'm sure that a household that fully kind of like understands and internalizes the idea that they're going to lose 8 years of their lives would consider this at least somewhat important, right? But I think somehow that message is not coming true, and I think this kind of user-centric approach, really understanding what the households are looking for and how can we make progress on this public health aspect while making life nicer and more convenient is really a big part of what should be done. Yeah.
I'd be interested in your views on two factors, particularly regarding success in electricity that you didn't mention. One would be overall quality of governance in the country, generally, and particularly quality of governance in the electric sector. And the other would be, from my viewpoint, the willingness of governments to actually charge consumers something approaching the cost of service. Many countries, I think India is a great example. Andhra Pradesh for years has always had a policy where they basically, they kept their books honest, and they basically had a utility that I don't think has ever gone bankrupt in its history. The opposite would be like Orissa, for example, which is billions, hundreds of millions, but not billions of dollars in deficit. And I think that has an impact on the ability to serve. Are these aspects looked at in your
Yeah, so quality of governance, I think, is very closely related to the idea of institutional capacity. And I prefer to use the word institutional capacity because quality of governance, I think, often has this connotation that it's like, free markets and low corruption and everything. If you look at these cases, that's actually not necessary for the work of electrifying. Whether you want to then create kind of profit-making private companies and so on, that's where quality of governance becomes more important. But what we think that the concept of institutional capacity covers some of the key aspects of quality of governance. But so just to give you an example again, China's electrification started in 1949. If you look at what happened there, I don't think you would call it quality of governance really. It wasn't really that. But if you look at how some of these lower level governments were able to benefit from capital subsidies from the central government in the 70s, they got the job done. So that's why we don't use the quality of governance word. In terms of the pricing issue, that's one of my favorite topics. I've written very extensively on this same topic. So in this case, I do think it's important. So in some of the successful models where these countries have been able to electrify are those where that problem disappears almost automatically. So if Brazil has an urban electrification rate of 90%, you typically don't have such a big difficulty charging tariffs from urban consumers because they're middle class, they consume a lot. It's quite easy to break even. So in a country like Brazil, this problem doesn't exist. In a country like India, like you just said, in many states it's been extremely difficult, and they often provide close to free electricity, which means that the financial viability of these utilities is just terrible, right? So I do think it's important, but one of the things that we see is I think very few of these countries, with the exception of maybe Chile, all of them are far away from having a fully viable and functional power system. They all have subsidies, they all have deficits and technical performance issues. So I think this is something that these countries are now starting to increasingly face, where they move from connecting households to trying to provide 24/7 electricity. I think that's where it becomes really important. And my view is that a country like India, let's say they celebrate 100% electrification in another 3 years, okay? Probably there's somebody somewhere there who doesn't have electricity, but rounding errors notwithstanding, at that point the real work starts, because then they have to find a way to improve the quality, and that's just not possible without both pricing and, on the other hand, also internal governance of the utilities. This is another huge problem, is that in many of these places, some of them have very few employees who are actually working there. So if you go to a distribution company, there's nobody there actually distributing anything. In others, there are way too many, and they're all just patronage jobs where they are there for political reasons and they don't actually know anything about electricity. So I think these issues are going to be even more important as we move forward with the work. Yeah.
I just have some questions kind of about the modeling that you did. The first one, just two questions. Were there any examples of like backsliding, I guess, or where you saw progress and then all of a sudden just like things got worse, and what were the factors that contributed to that? And then also, was there any sort of like cultural control or societal control of just kind of like the values? I'm thinking of India in particular. Like, I think different castes may have different things that they value or think are important, and how that was controlled for. I mean, right, if it can be, or that kind of stuff.
So on the first one, if we look at backsliding in just in terms of these rates is very rare. So if you have a peaceful country, it's almost never the case that the electrification rate, the clean cooking rate would go down. Even if the economy is doing terribly, you can kind of like defend the gains that you have. The cases of backsliding would be civil war. So if you look at Zimbabwe, for example, or something. Zimbabwe, but it's technically civil war, but you get the point, right? So cases where you have these like massive social problems, and those result then in infrastructure destruction. So what we did, in fact, when we were looking through these numbers, we flagged any case where they say electrification rate is decreased, and then we did a detailed study, is this even remotely realistic? And in most cases, it turned out it was just a sampling error, right? So you get two surveys. Surveys are never perfect. They use a slightly different definition or something, and as a result, it was a fluke, right? So mostly you just see like stagnant at best.
So once you get it, you got it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of, even if you think of these like post-Soviet countries, when they collapse and their economies contracted by 30%, it's not like people lost their electricity connections. So that's actually quite rare. And that's good news, right? Because it means that once we make some progress, we get to keep it. Huh? So that's good. On the second point of culture, so we kind of tried to build it to some extent, I guess, into the government interest idea. So we don't really have an elaborate coding of what Brazilian culture looks like.
Yeah, I mean,
that's way beyond our capabilities, right? But what we tried to do is we tried to get a sense of if there's a lot of public pressure. So in the Brazilian case, the constitutional provision was a kind of a telltale sign there's something happening here. This would not be the constitution if people didn't think it's really important, right? In the case of South Africa, if you go and look at the public debates and newspapers in 1994, they all talk about electricity piped water, topics like that. So you could see this thing where electricity was always a big thing, but the people who needed it were not, they had no rights before that. So we try to do as much as we can, but I don't think we have like high quality ethnographic accounts of the culture of electricity. I'd love to do that though, that would be super interesting.
It sounds kind of like maybe your variable is like a grassroots pressurometer.
Yeah, that's right. That we try to get a sense, is there some sense that the governments are feeling pressure to do this just for political, setting aside the economic benefits? Yeah.
But building on that, it's not just the government feeling pressure too, it's the people receiving it, wanting it. Is it, I mean, that seems to be a big part of solving a lot of these problems are, you have people coming in thinking they should have it, but there's no buy-in on the user end.
That's right.
So did you take into account too of how you work with the users to figure out how to solve the problem? Kind of more of the bottom-up approach.
Yes, so I think, well, one piece of evidence is very clear is that when they had these local accountability mechanisms and kind of participation, you often saw very high levels of buy-in and they were quite successful. I think, generally speaking, if you look at demand for electricity, people tend to have a fairly uniform, positive view that we would like to have electricity. With cooking fuels, I don't think anybody would be opposed to having free LPG to use when you happen to have it, but people don't feel the same kind of priority or commitment to this as they would with electricity. And these governments actually often sort of like dig their own grave by, they make a big deal of this electricity thing, and then when the elections come, then people ask, well, where's the electricity, right? And so the governments have no choice but to keep going. So if you think of again the Modi government and the Singh government in India, I don't think it was ever a realistic idea for Modi to say that, look, the Congress government had this terrible idea of giving electricity to people. We are just going to ignore that and keep things as they are. They were stuck with this idea where now everybody wanted to have it. So.
Right. Though I guess I think of like the whole sanitation issue in India, where you have a lot of people going in saying, because that relates to water and whatnot, and you have the users not really interested in a lot of the Western solutions. So
yeah, and I think sanitation is a really difficult one because it is such strong kind of like cultural norms that it's probably impossible to understand for us here when we go to the bank and sign these $1 billion contracts. We often don't realize what's happening there. In India, there's a super interesting campaign now where the government is putting out these like ads where you've got somebody defecating in the open and like using a smartphone at the same time. And then there, exactly. And then there is this sort of like text saying like, come on, like, you know, modern India or something like that. I think it's a pretty like bold campaign in the sense that it really brings these things into attention. Whether it will actually influence the attitudes, we'll have to see. The interesting thing is Bangladesh has almost completely ended openification. They started at the same level as India. It's all gone. So there's something interesting happening here as well. I think I'd be happy to take one more question if there is, or should we just? All right, excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming. I enjoyed this. This was fun.